first start explain how this book project began. It came out in January of 2015, and it was about 10 years in the making. My first trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in 2005 when I was a graduate student at American University. And up to that point, all of my academic career and my career as a social and political activist had revolved around issues with the Black freedom struggle and civil rights. Nuclear weapons were not really on my radar. And the first time I went to Hiroshima and met with atomic bomb survivors, I was so moved, I was so filled with guilt and anger, that when I came back, I met with my advisor, my mentor at the time, Peter Kuznick, and I said, I have to find a way to combine these two passions of mine, eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons. And he said to me, answer me one question. What did African Americans think about dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And when I pitched this idea to colleagues, most of them said, you're not going to find much of a response because African Americans, understandably so, were not worried about this issue. They were too worried trying to gain their own freedom and equality. They didn't have time for this. Well, they were wrong. On June 6, 1964, a group of atomic bomb survivors and activists on a world peace study mission came to the United States, specifically to Harlem. Their trip was organized by an amazing Japanese-American activist we lost recently, Yuri Kachiyama. And she said to them, while you're here, what is it that you want to do most? And the survivor said, meet Malcolm X. But Malcolm at the time was traveling through the Middle East, traveling through Africa. She didn't know if she could get a hold of him. She wrote him letters, wrote to his office, but to no avail. And the last day, she was having a reception at her apartment, and there was a knock at the door. And she opened the door, and there stood Malcolm. He came back. And he said to the survivors of the atomic bomb, you've been scarred by the atomic bomb, but we've also been scarred here. The bomb that scarred us was racism. He spent the day talking to them about imperialism, colonialism, the Vietnam War. Because Malcolm understood what so many before him understood, which was that how these things were inextricably linked. How colonialism, how freedom here, how peace were the same fight. So my book examines those black activists who connected the fight for freedom in the United States with nuclear disarmament and liberation movements around the world. Now, for so long, African American history, the way it's taught in this country, is completely separate from US history. Right? We're on the cusp of February for Black History Month, so let's jam in everything we possibly can for that month. I have some of my students that will say, where's White History Month? And of course, the answer is the other 11. Even if you look at textbooks, you have Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in their nice, neat little categorical boxes, teach what's safe, and that covers Black history. And over the last 2 decades, scholars have begun to look at the role of African Americans in foreign affairs and international relations, studying Pan-Africanism and colonialism movements. But where my book differs is that the majority of the scholars, the consensus, is that any international relations, any foreign affairs involvement of the black community in the United States essentially ends in the 1950s when McCarthyism hits. That anti-communism spread through this country and severed those ties, and so many groups fell mute. And that is true to a degree. But if you specifically look at the issue of nuclear disarmament, you will see that these bonds are not broken, and they survived through the 1950s, into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. And so I started asking a series of questions. What role did it play in the black community that the first victims of the atomic bombing were non-white? What role did it play that the discrimination African Americans faced in this country led to a more critical critique of US foreign policy? What role did the Black Popular Front play in these movements? When the US dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the majority of the American public rejoiced. Gallup ran a poll not long after, less than a month later, in which 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs. Roper ran a poll right after it in which showed that 22.7% of the American public wished Japan hadn't surrendered, so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And in fact, no poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of American respondents critical of Truman's decision. But that was not the case in the black community. Now, of course, nothing is monolithic. This is not to say the entire black community was in agreement. But many in the black community, activists, poets, journalists, clergy, they didn't wait for an organized movement. And they were some of those that immediately came out against Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons in Japan. Now, some of this actually predates the atomic bombings. For some in the black community, and there was a split there, but for some of the black community, they looked at Japanese internment and said, here are a group of people being put in prisons for no crime they committed, but simply for their race. This could happen to us. We know that the Japanese had sent agents into the United States to work with the Nation of Islam and try to get black support. There was support built into the black community because it was Japan in 1935 that said publicly they were coming to the aid of Ethiopia when Mussolini invaded rather than the United States. Those like Du Bois had already visited Japan and was lionized there. So there was already support built in. And so one of the first places I started to look was the black press. Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, these newspapers were critical in where the black community got their news, their opinions. And overwhelmingly, the editors and the columnists were criticizing Truman's decision. But I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to see what the general public thought. So I started going through letters to the editor in all of these newspapers. Now, when I talk to young students at book talks and I say this, they don't understand because for them, they can go into a ProQuest database, put in a couple keywords and click search, it's done. I was in the Library of Congress on microfilm going through issue by issue trying to read every letter to the editor. And what I saw, whether it was beauty shop owners or domestic workers or truck drivers, the same thing. Overwhelmingly critical of Truman's decision. Even those that were happy the war ended were still critical of the decision to use nuclear weapons. Langston Hughes was one of the first to actually come out and question Truman's racism in this decision, writing in the Chicago Defender. And he was certainly right to do so. Harry Truman was, if not the most, certainly one of the most racist presidents in United States history. This is a man that if you go through his journals and his diaries, his letters to his wife Bess, you will rarely ever find him referring to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. This is a man that sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan when he was working in Missouri, but they sent it back to him because he refused to fire Catholic workers in his business. He used to brag in interviews that in his family you got slaves to start out the housekeeping with as a wedding present. And his mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. And this racism certainly expanded into Japan when we dropped the atomic bomb, and he was told that we now instantly killed 140,000 people. The first thing he did was jump up and say, quote, "This is the greatest thing in history." Zora Neale Hurston, who many argue is very apolitical throughout her career, not on this issue. I found a letter she wrote to her friend Claude Barnett, in which she called Truman, quote, "the butcher of Asia," and was visibly upset that the black community was not rising up and doing more. I started to go through sermons of black pastors, and overwhelmingly, again, I would see the same response, that we don't have enough religion to stop this Frankenstein that we let out, and looking at the role that race plays in this decision. But probably of all the immediate response, the most critical, the loudest, came from the Black Popular Front, especially W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Du Bois referred to Truman, he compared him to Hitler, calling him one of the greatest killers of our day. He referred to Japan as, he said this would set back the progress of colored nations for years and decades to come. I'm so glad that the director of 12 Years a Slave, Steve McQueen, has now agreed to do a biopic of Paul Robeson. This amazing individual, this hero who was so lost in our history, completely ignored. My students have no idea who he is. And it was Robeson who immediately connected this to the colonialism issue. In June of 1946, they're at Madison Square Garden. There's a rally of 20,000 people. And he asked the question, where is the United States getting our uranium to make atomic bombs? And the answer, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo. He repeatedly would appear at May Day parades with an anti-nuclear banner. But so much of this changed in 1947, when Harry Truman issued what is now known as the Truman Doctrine. Long before George W. Bush ever said, with us or against us, it was Truman who put that line in the sand and said, you are either with us or you are with communism. And anti-communism spread through this country. The worst thing you could be labeled was to be black and red. And to be anti-nuclear now meant you were pro-communist. So yes, for a lot of groups, they fell silent. Groups like the National Negro Congress and the Council of African Affairs, they ceased to exist. That's how hard it was for these groups to survive during this climate. Groups like the NAACP on this issue made a strategic decision at this time, and they made a sharp turn to the right, aligning themselves with Truman, hoping it would result in civil rights, which of course doesn't happen. But not everybody looked at peace as a bargaining chip. For those like Du Bois and Robeson and others, they saw what was happening now with the Korean War. And we threatened to use nuclear weapons in Korea. They didn't want another Hiroshima in Korea. They weren't going to let another non-white group of people be destroyed. They saw a real arms race happening because we dropped the bomb in 45 and the Russians get it in 49. When we developed the hydrogen bomb in 52, they caught us. They get it in 53. And now the arms race is actually on. And at the same time, there was a new peace movement starting out of Soviet bloc nations. And out of this movement, out of Stockholm in particular, came what is now known as the Ban the Bomb petition. Du Bois and Robeson, their wives and others, formed what is known as the Peace Information Center in the United States. And they took it upon themselves to try to get signatures for the Ban the Bomb petition. They focused largely on the black community. Hundreds of millions of people signed this petition around the world. In the United States, over 2.5 million signed it. Charlie Parker, Marian Anderson, and so many more. Now when I tell my students or younger kids today that there was this Ban the Bomb petition, of course their attitude is big deal. Because now they can sit on their couch and go on change.org and they're one click away from signing their petition, and that's their activism or clicktivism. That's it. But there were real consequences back then to sign a petition like this. People lost their jobs. People were physically beaten. They were blacklisted. Their lives were destroyed. So if you look at 1950, here we are on the cusp of the civil rights movement, and it's African Americans in many ways leading the fight to ban the bomb and put their lives on the line for this petition, it's extraordinary. When the mid-1950s comes, so many things are happening in this country and indeed around the world. In 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, of course, desegregating schools. A year later, in 1955, we have the heinous murder of Emmett Till. In December of 55, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But in that same year, in 1955, while those things were happening, we have what is now known as the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the first all-African Asian conference. And if you read the platform of that conference, you will see that they focused on three things: eliminating racism, colonialism, and nuclear disarmament.